Okay, so I'm Martin. That's Birgitta, still wrestling with the computer and hopefully getting things to work, or not. We don't know. But anyway, so the title of this talk is Cultivating Architecture. And you might find that a rather odd phrase. I mean, why do we talk about cultivating? So I'm going to sort of break down a little bit about what this talk's about. And we have no clicker. Yeah. That's okay. Is it just not even doing anything? Oh, yeah, it is. Okay, so, and we begin that by talking about the architecture part of this. So when we talk about architecture, it's important to know, well, what on earth do we mean by architecture? And architecture is one of those words that's tossed around a great deal in the software world, and it obviously has some relevance to buildings, but it doesn't really mean what it means in the building world. And this is something that's very notable to me because my wife is a structural engineer, and certainly during her days of working on bridges and tunnels, she did not take architects very seriously at all. So there's no way I could call myself an architect and have any credibility. So it's a topic I explored a little bit in an article a long time ago when I was editing the design column for IEEE software. And when I was doing that, I decided I'd really focus very much on an explanation that was described about this from Ralph Johnson. And he was reacting initially to a statement that architecture was all about people saying, well, what are the main subsystems in a system and how do they connect together? And he said that he felt that was not a very useful definition. And instead, he said a better way of thinking about it is what is the shared understanding of the senior people on a project? And that shared understanding might reflect itself in different ways, depending on different kinds of projects, because, of course, it depends, is the answer to many of these questions. But that shared understanding and trying to cultivate a shared understanding was very important. Another aspect of architecture that I think is a very good way of thinking about architecture is asking yourself, what are the things that are hard to change? And because, obviously, if we can change things easily, then they no longer become such a critical thing. And in fact, that's why one of the things I like to say about architecture is we want to, the best architects remove architecture by making things easy to change. But fundamentally, what does both of these threads in architecture, the shared understanding and the hard to change, have in common? And that really leads to the definition I like best about architecture, is that it's the important stuff on your project, whatever it happens to be. And that sounds like a bit of a flip phrase. Oh, architecture's the important stuff. Well, that doesn't really mean anything. But the key thing of this message is every project, every team has to decide what is architectural for their particular cases. You have to go through that decision yourself. It's not something you can just pull from somewhere else. So that's one aspect of architecture. That's how I look at what architecture is. Another question that's important is why? Because if you're trying to understand something and try and talk about how to do something well, you have to understand, well, why on earth is this important in the first place? And when talking about this, probably my best way of talking about it is to use a little pseudograph. So in this pseudograph, what I'm doing is I'm plotting the cumulative features or functionality of a system and looking at it over time. And a large amount of software projects that I run into, if we make this graph, it looks like this. We're able to make progress early on and able to move quickly, but then as time goes on, it gets harder and harder to do things. Because every time you want to do something, you have to go back to what you did before, and you have to work with what you want to do with the stuff you had to do before, and you find yourself getting slower and slower and slower over time. How many people have been on projects like that? Yeah, pretty much everybody sticks their hand up. But sometimes you can have projects where you can actually not just stop that curve from bending down, but actually get some kind of acceleration over time as well. And that's what good architecture does, is it gives you a bit more of a boost. In projects like this, you can find there's a period where you seem to go faster over time rather than slower, because you're putting things together and you're actually able to put new features out by assembling some of the existing features more quickly. How many people have been on projects like that? Less hands, but there's always some hands when I ask that question. And what we're trying to do with architecture is to get that more accelerated state to reduce the point at which things are going to slow down in the future. And that is important, because what we're talking about, the reason to have architecture, and indeed the reason to put our efforts into improving the quality, at least the internal quality of any software system, is because we want to deliver more stuff more quickly. Some people will say, oh, you've got to focus on architecture because it's your engineering responsibility, or make it some kind of moral statement or professional quality. But that's never a very good argument, because people want more features more quickly. And the economics always overcomes any statement of engineering professionalism. So it's important that when we put our efforts into thinking about architecture, we always justify them based on economics. We are doing this in order to ship more features more quickly. With an economic argument, we have a much better justification for any of the kinds of things that we talk about in this talk or anywhere else here at the conference. Always remember that it's the economics that matters, not any sort of statement of professional what's-it-ink. So that's the architecture part. So why do we use the cultivating word? What's that about? So when we talk about cultivating, I would really like to come back to a phrase in the Agile Manifesto. You may not be as familiar with this phrase in the Agile Manifesto, because this is on the principles page, which most people know the values, the this over that part, but the principles are also very important. And one of the things that we brought out, in fact, when we wrote the manifesto, was this belief that we got our best work when you had these self-organizing teams. And self-organizing was the phrase that we used, but a phrase that's become more common these days is autonomous teams. Give teams the ability to make their own decisions about what matters, about indeed architecture. What is important? Well, it's going to be different from one team to another. So you give people the autonomy to choose that. And why is it that we think having autonomous teams is important? Well, I think that has been fairly nicely thrashed out in more detail by the efforts of the State of DevOps report. Nicole Forsgren et al. I always refer to it now as Forsgren et al. Because that way Jez Humble just becomes part of al, and it's good to do that. But what Nicole and her colleagues did was they tried to look at what are the relationships between the various things that we can look at to try and tease out what make good engineering principles. And if you look in the State of DevOps report, you'll find lots of these kinds of diagrams that try to show how various things affect other things. So one of the most fundamental things that comes out of this is that software delivery performance correlates with organizational performance. That is, if you've got a software delivery organization that's performing well, that tends to mean you've got an organization that performs very well. Which means, yes, you want to make sure you've got good software delivery performance. And one of the things that helps drive that is autonomy. Autonomy, because you've got teams that are more engaged, more able to solve problems their own way, they're able to improve the overall delivery performance. And that's something that they have shown through their research. Now, there's a whole upward thread, you'll notice, at the top of this diagram that talks about trust and voice and organizational culture. I show that because that's part of a diagram that I'm nicking here, but we'll actually explore that a little bit later in the talk. So from this, we see that autonomy is important. And we need to have some kind of way of getting autonomous teams. But if you've got multiple autonomous teams, how do you ensure that they're all working together and not pulling in different directions? And the common answer to this is to say, well, we need to govern the teams. We need to push them so that they're operating in the same way. But what do we mean when we say to govern? Well, there are really two different ways of looking at this. One is a kind of command-oriented approach that says we must control things and restrain people from doing bad things and put that kind of forceful, from a leadership down point of view. But another way of looking at governorship is to say, well, we think of it more as guide. Think of it like a guidebook for someone to choose their own path. In this way, we want to provide that influence, but leave people to decide how to work with that principle. And if we want to operate with autonomous teams, we need to sort of arrange things so that we minimize the amount of rule-based governance and maximize the amount of guidance-based governance. So when we're talking about cultivating an architecture, the question is, how can we do this? How can we move from a central architect organization telling everybody what to do into an area where you've got autonomous teams able to do their own thing, but still work in a collective fashion that moves in a good direction? That was the vision we had with the Agile Manifesto. The question is, how do we make it work in practice? Birgitta.
Yeah, and we want to talk you through a few building blocks of this guidance-based approach that we've seen or that we find important. This is by far not everything, not comprehensively everything you can do, but these are the ones that we want to talk through. So different things that you can do to align teams so that they are set up for success to create a useful and sustainable architecture together. And all of the things we're going to talk about, actually, I have a lot of examples there from an organizational level, but all of those things you can actually also think of in the context of a business unit with multiple teams or in the context of your own team. And I'm going to start with the root of everything, because ultimately the purpose of why we're doing architecture is that the architecture needs to serve the business, needs to create value somehow. Right? And the people on the several autonomous teams that are working on a system together, as they are shaping their respective pieces of the architecture, they need to have a similar understanding of the business context. And I mean that beyond things like domain-driven design. And they need to understand how architecture can ultimately contribute value. And this might seem obvious, and it's mentioned a lot, but we're actually still seeing a lot that either the more technical roles on a team are not that much interested in what's going on in the business, or people from the business or product side just assuming that the more technical roles, they don't need to know that much. So if you have relevant business context, on the one hand, think about how to push it to teams. So one simple way to do that is maybe in the team space, put up something like here in the background to remind yourselves daily of the high-level priorities that you have so that you can refer back to them. Or you could work on a team or a business unit kind of like quarterly or 6-monthly mission statement to kind of say this is what we want to focus on for the business in those next few months, and that's actually also a great tool to check with the stakeholders if that's actually what they expect from you. On the other hand, if you need business context for your work as a developer, for example, try to ask for it more. And also work with the business if you feel like, oh, they can't really tell me what the business purpose is, because maybe you're in a phase where they're also figuring that out. You know, don't just wait for them to come to you, but maybe you can help somehow. So the obvious thing is to ask for insights, how the users are actually using the system, and also the minimum thing is probably to have really a basic understanding of how the business makes money if you work for a profit organization. Otherwise, you might be spending a lot of time on fine-tuning something that isn't even valuable, and you might end up with problems like this, solving imaginary scaling issues at scale.
And don't underestimate the human part of this. Remember the comment, the example that Randy showed earlier on, where he talked about how important it was to get the engineers visible and seeing what was going on in the manufacturing. You want a lot of informal contact between the software people and the business people. And you want that human connection, because it's much more motivating to make human beings happy than it is to try and make some document happy. So make sure you have that human connection. The next thing we look at is an area that's architecture, we refer to as architecture requirements. And this comes under various phrases: cross-functional requirements, non-functional requirements, architecture requirements. Various terms come up about this. and are often referred to as the illities, because everybody always sort of takes all of these and puts them in. And the trouble is, there's a hell of a lot of these illities that exist that potentially that you could want to worry about. And they're all usually all things that you actually do want to care about. But trying to care about them all tends to mean that you can't actually make many progress on many of those things. So one of the most important things to do in terms of dealing with this, when it comes to architectural thinking, is for people to focus on particular areas, to say there are certain things that are going to matter for one organization as opposed to another. Now, when it comes to these autonomous teams, what you'll find is that the different teams will pick different subsets to focus on of these items. But at the same time, there needs to be some conversation across the whole audience, the whole organization, to show where the commonality exists between teams.
Yeah, and there are in particular some things that maybe in this duality between guiding and ruling, there are maybe some things on the organizational level where you actually want to have more control, like compliance or internationalization might be something that's really important that you kind of need to have fast rules about, and other things is more guiding and differs more between business units and teams.
One technique that we found useful that helps to do this is the idea of having sliders. Basically, you have trade-off sliders by which you take various of the illities and you plot on the sliders where there should be most important, or I like the phrase here, least negotiable, as opposed to the more negotiable things on the left. Now, the danger, of course, with these sliders, and we did have a client in Australia who said, oh, well, everything goes over to the right, maximum to the right. And of course, that doesn't kind of help. So one technique you might use in that situation is to say, well, you only have 20 points, and you've got 10 sliders that all go up to a maximum of 5. Allocate the 20. And obviously, you can't push them all to the right in that case, and they have to decide, do they all get an even amount, or do some get more than another? The main thing that we're trying to get out of this is some sense of prioritization, the realization that not all illities are equal. So prioritize, that's the key.
And next I want to spend a longer amount of time actually talking about principles. So this is one way to achieve alignment that we've seen quite a few organizations use over the past few years, is to create a set of principles for all the autonomous teams in the engineering organization. So what is an architecture principle? And we've linked here a really good talk about using architecture principles by Owen Woods. That's really highly recommended. And his definition of a principle is that it is a declarative statement made with the intention of guiding architectural design decisions in order to achieve one or more qualities of a system. So, and if these words just all jumble up in your head now, I try to visualize it a little bit more. So a principle is a statement, and the purpose of it is that we want it to guide our decision making. Ideally, when we have all those autonomous teams, kind of guide them in a similar way, so that ultimately together we can achieve an enhancement of system qualities that we want, which would be the requirements that Martin just talked about, and also the business goals, of course. So here's an example of a principle that's out there in the wild. The title here is Smarts in the Nodes, Not the Network. So catchy title always helps for people to remember. But then, of course, you need more details. So there's a sentence here talking about how this means that systems aim to be as decoupled and cohesive as possible and not centrally choreographed. So this is definitely a declarative statement. So declarative meaning, you know, describing the state in the future that we want to achieve. We have an intention of achieving that state. But I don't know about you, but as a developer in a team, if somebody would show you this principle, you might not yet know how does this actually guide my design decisions, or what are actually the qualities of a system, right? So that's why there's usually more. So you have the declarative statement. And then it's super important to then talk about what is the rationale, what is the reasoning behind why we think that is getting us closer to the qualities of our system. So in this case, they even mention like that they want to evolve over time, keep up with the pace of change, and they want to change quickly. So that's their rationale behind this. And then the implications and examples give some more practical guidance what this actually means and how this might affect your design decisions.
And a very useful use of example is to point to exemplars within your own systems. Often when we're trying to do something, we'll want to look at some example code or look at some examples that are actually working, and we're going to take that and use that as a kind of starting point to learn from. If you have those in the organization, raise those up. Say, go to this area, this shows an exemplar of this principle in action.
Yeah. Or another thing you could put here is the potential cost of not doing this, so that you know what you're doing if you decide to deviate from this, because there are always good reasons in some situations to deviate from this. And this structure of having a statement, rationale, and implications is actually taken from the TOGAF architecture principles definition. TOGAF is an open framework that some enterprise architects use to think about enterprise architecture. This example was taken from the John Lewis software engineering principles. They're public on the internet. John Lewis is a large department store chain in the UK. So it's a real-world example of a large organization having many autonomous teams, and they formulated 18 principles, and you can look them up and maybe get inspired by them. So that's one way to do this, just come up with a list of them and use this TOGAF structure. Another way to do this is what, in my head, I always call the three-column approach. And there's an example of it in Sam Newman's Building Microservices book. And there's these three columns. The strategic goal, so kind of the business context we talked about, then the principles themselves, and then something more practical, design and delivery practices. So it's more practical guidance for teams, like how to actually do their work so that they can follow the principles, so making them a bit more real. So this is another way to basically define the rationale, why you're doing things, and the implications. And I like that it's kind of like a nice visual overview and everything is in one place, so you always have that context. So an example of this might be, let's say your organization wants to enter a new market, and maybe they want to focus more on customer centricity. Then a principle you might have, and again, catchy title, facts over opinion. So you want to focus more on driving things through data maybe. And then practices you might want to establish could be things like hypothesis-driven development or data democratization. So access to your data for everybody in the organization so they can use it to guide their decisions.
And it's kind of appropriate to see this kind of approach used in Sam Newman's book on building microservices, because of course the whole way microservices was defined at the beginning was through the idea of principles. So that way that people could see that although there were differences in how different people approached the idea, there was a common set of principles that most microservice implementations followed most of the time.
And also note here that there's no one path through these columns, so it's like an M-to-N relationship between the things in those columns. So facts over opinions is another example of a principle, and there's actually lots of them out there. And some of them also might seem quite obvious to you. You know, there's blog posts about them, and you talk about them all the time as good or even best practices. So scale horizontally, automate repetitive tasks. So some of you might think, duh, that's already on the internet. We hear about it on the conference. Why should we create our own principles on top of that, like just for us? First reason why you might consider this is focus. Again, like with the architectural requirements, you can't do everything. You have to find what you want to focus on at a moment in time. And I think of principles in the organizational context not as a comprehensive list of this is all the things we want to follow and we're ignoring the rest, but more what's needed in the moment to move you forward. And maybe a principle is successfully applied if you feel like you no longer need to highlight it and you scratch it out and maybe move on to another one. The second reason why you might want your own is to find consensus, because if you want your principles to be more guidance than control, then they have to be at a higher abstraction level, so teams can still have leeway to interpret them for their context. So the more abstract something is, the more different interpretations there are going to be. People have different experiences, different opinions, and so the process of creating these principles is actually like a journey to get a common understanding with each other and also learn from each other. And finally, another reason why you might want this is kind of to give some things an official blessing. So depending on your organizational culture, you might want to make some things explicit and say that they are now sanctioned and actually wanted by management. For example, if you have something like you want people to experiment more, but that might be scary to some people if they've been punished for a failure in the past, right? So making this explicit and management sanctioned and also adding guidance to it, what it means, provides some safety for people to actually do this. So then if you want to do this, how do you find your principles? How do you determine your focus? And over the past few years, I've seen 3 different approaches to this. The first one was kind of a upfront, top-down approach. There was an architecture board established, and that board came up with some principles and then went to the teams and asked the teams, okay, so how are you applying this? And what was good about that was that in that board, there was actually lots of experience in the room, a lot of very experienced people, and there was direct awareness of the ultimate goals and the strategy of the program that we were working on. But what was not so good was that the people on the board didn't have any direct hands-on involvement in the delivery work, and which on the other hand meant there was no representation of the teams in this board. And they also didn't document a rationale in the beginning. So it was really hard for teams to accept these and not like spend a lot of energy on questioning what they were there for. The second approach I've seen is kind of a step-by-step approach. So this organization had a mission that they were embarking on, which was like a big re-platforming. And step by step, as they were scaling up the teams, having more teams coming across challenges, they discussed those challenges in a tech guild, and then step by step came up with these principles as they were facing the challenges. And the third approach I've seen was also an upfront approach, so let's come up with a list of principles, but it was more collaborative than the one with the architecture board I talked about. So I want to show you one idea for a workshop you can do to come up with an initial list of principles that you can then try out and iterate on. And some of you might recognize this. It's actually inspired by a form of a retrospective, often called the speedboat exercise or sailboat exercise. And so basically the teams are the sailboats in the middle, yeah, and they want to get to the light tower. So you get business and tech together in a room, so you don't just do this with the techies, and you talk about the goals first, and that's the business context and the architecture requirements. And ideally, those are already defined in there, but otherwise you could still start with some more generic ones, like usually everybody wants faster time to market, right? So that would be something to start with. And it's a good start for this conversation to maybe point out gaps in what you don't know about that light tower yet. And then secondly, you go and you brainstorm together what's the wind and the anchors and the cliffs here in the middle. So what's moving us forward today, what's holding us back today, and what might be coming up in the future that might trip us up. And what you're basically doing here in a kind of like more playful way is you're doing a SWOT analysis, right? So strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And then you cluster those and see what are maybe your biggest problems today that are holding you back from the light tower. And you find some principles that you think would help you focus on some of these weaknesses or maybe building out some of those strengths. And so you could, for example, use one of those big lists of principles that are already out there on the internet to see which ones match your problems. And when you do that, always look for things with cross-team relevance. So you still want those teams to be autonomous, but total autonomy is also a myth, right? They're still working together on the same system, so they need to talk to each other. So the most useful principles are the ones that actually have relevance in cross-team collaboration. And then also in the workshop, you could work on like a template like this together, break out into groups, and then work on what the principle could be called, what are the related business goals, what is the rationale. Maybe in the rationale, you could pick up some of those anchors you found. So you're saying, we want to get better at this, so that's why we're doing this. And also maybe a few things like, how would you describe success? So that you can already envision what it would look like if this is actually useful. So the next challenge then is kind of like how to make principles more relevant to people.
So, whoops. So, sorry, I'm having trouble with the clicker there. So the technique that can be very useful to help get a sense of how to make these practices and various tools work is a technique, the technology radar. Now, you may have come across this as something that ThoughtWorks produces. We produce one of these technology radars every 6 months. But in this context, to this audience, I really want to talk of it as a tool that you can use within your organization. You'll notice this isn't the ThoughtWorks technology radar. This is an organization called Zalando that put this together. And the idea, the origin of the radar at ThoughtWorks was we had a lot of teams going out doing projects. This was back nearly 10 years ago now, and even at that point we were several thousand people, we were distributed all over the world, and how did we share what was going on from a project team over here in the US with another team in the UK and somebody else doing something in Australia? We needed somehow to get an idea of what we were learning globally. And it was during a meeting of one of our technical leadership group that we came up with the idea of this radar exercise. And it was Darren Smith, I think, who came up with the basic metaphor of the radar. And the idea was really to look at the various tools and techniques and try and think of their relevance as how close they were in this term of this radar sequence. When we do the radar, we divide it into quadrants for different kinds of things. We put tools in one quadrant and techniques in another. But actually, the quadrants aren't terribly important. You divide up however you think you like to. We don't actually argue very much about quadrants in the meeting. But what we do focus on is this idea of the rings. And the easiest way, perhaps, to look at the rings is to go from the inside out, even though the arrow's pointing in, because that's the direction of most importance. It's easier to describe than coming out. So the adopt ring is the stuff that's proven, that you know that that can work well in your organization, and that you feel comfortable if a team says, yes, we're going to use these technologies and tools in the adopt ring, then we can go with that.
Yeah, and these absolutely don't have to be the adopt things that were just on the latest technology radar that we do of the newest things that are that we've seen come up, but actually the things that work in your organization. So you know, you have to adjust your thinking a little bit if you're familiar with our radar to you know, your organizational context.
The trial ring is for a technology that you think it looks very promising. It's something that you think could well be in the adopt ring in short order, but you need to try it out first. And this is where you want one or two of the autonomous teams to actually run with this and build something and do something in practice. At ThoughtWorks, our rule for our trial ring is one of our teams that actually have to have used this, and it's actually have to have been on a project that's gone all the way into production, and so we've actually got that degree of learning from it. Now, in a build-your-own radar context, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think it really should be something you're prepared to put on a production running a system that's heading towards production, and you're evaluating it to see where you want to go. And then at some point, you might decide to whether to move it into adopt or not later on. The next ring out is the assess ring. And the assess ring is for things that you're curious about, but you're not actually ready to use yet. So we need to pay more attention to this. We need to think about that's something you want to watch it. You may want to do some proof of concept experiments, but not anything in a production context. And again, you want to get people from all over the organization, from the different autonomous teams, to talk about what they feel they should be assessing, what they feel should be trialing, so that you've got some sense of what the different people are looking at. The outer ring is the hold ring. And the hold ring has a number of different meanings. We often use it to be, we see this being used a lot in the industry and we think it's a bad idea. So things like separate testing teams are put on the adopt ring, or safe is put on the adopt ring, because we don't like it very much. But for an organization, yes, that might be a good idea to say certain technologies, we don't want to see those. But sometimes it might be for technologies that have been used a great deal, but you don't want to use any more going forwards. And so you put those in the hold ring to say, okay, I know we've got a lot of this in-house, it did well for its time, but now we think there are better alternatives, and so we want you to replace anything in the hold ring with something on the adopt ring. And you can construct, we take a 4-day global meeting to construct our radars. And we do that twice a year. And having a multi-day meeting like that, getting people together to discuss about what they see and they use, and doing it at some kind of regular intervals. We do it twice a year. You probably won't need to do it so frequently, but make sure it is this collaborative exercise that you pull together. Now, another phrase that we use occasionally is the idea of sensible defaults. And this is really an outgrowth of the idea of what goes in the adopt ring, another way of thinking about the adopt ring, is to say, these are the kind of default starting points that we think are a sensible thing. We're not going to be surprised if you use this stuff. And that then can be a basis. Most of what most projects do should be the things in that adopt sensible defaults area. But there should also be always a few things that people are doing that are in that trial space so that you're able to experiment with new ideas.
Yeah. And what I really like about this, this phrase, sensible defaults, is that on the one hand it implies that, that this is something that really helps you do the right thing and gets you started quickly, but it's also a default. So it also kind of communicates that as a team you still have, you still have the last word in deciding what you need for your context. So all of these things ultimately, as I said in the beginning, are supposed to be input into teams' decision making. So design decisions, tech stack decisions, contracts with other teams, and so on. And if all these things don't help you with making good decisions on the teams, then they don't work quite well yet. So either they don't work for you, or maybe you haven't done them right yet. And I just want to mention one thing here about decisions, something that is missing in what feels to me like 90% of the cases from what I see is documentation of the decisions. So one reason why this is so important is that we're just super forgetful. And ironically, we constantly forget that we're forgetful because we're making decisions and they make a lot of sense for us in the moment. We're really excited that we finally get to a decision and we start implementing because we're impatient going forward. And then 6 months later, somebody joins the team and it's like, why did you do it like this and not like that? And maybe you vaguely remember, but it's often like, I'm not quite sure yet. It's historically grown, you know. And what that actually leads to is that you're, in a certain way, you're blind in changing that decision because you might not even remember what the context was when you made it. And also, documentation of our decisions help us reflect how good we are at decision making. There's this thing called outcome bias, which says that we think that when a decision has a bad outcome, it was a bad decision, and when a decision has a good outcome, it was a good decision. But that's actually not true, right? So bad decisions can have good outcomes. Best example is if you gamble, right? You might win some money and you think, oh, it was a great decision. I went and gambled, but maybe next time it doesn't turn out as well. And yeah?
Yeah, and that was one of the things I'll point out. Notice that the structure here is just a plain text markdown structure. It's a very good idea to have these records as part of your code base. Check them into Git as part of your repository, and that way anybody can easily search them and you can see the history of their change over time.
Mm-hmm. And we take decisions in tech all the time that might be good decisions but actually have a bad outcome, right? So, and this often leads to kind of blaming each other or architecture shaming, right? So something bad happens because of a decision we took 6 months ago and people say, oh, why didn't you do it like, you know, differently in the first place? And recording the decision in the moment and acknowledging this outcome bias can help to a certain extent counteract that, toxicity in the culture, because you can say, oh, look here, this is what we actually knew at the time. And to me, it always feels a bit freeing to write a decision record because I know I'm actually writing down what I knew at the time, and it makes me feel better later when I can explain why I did that. So now let's say you have a first draft of those puzzle pieces in place with lots of energy and good intentions. How do you actually go apply it, iterate on it, and keep it alive? So how do you make it effective, and how do you know it's effective? And I want to go back to the state of, a part of the State of DevOps report that Martin mentioned in the beginning. And we talked about autonomy a lot, and as you can see here, they also showed a a relationship between autonomy and voice, so the probability of people to actually speak up and trust in their leadership. So if, as a result of, you think you've provided teams autonomy, but they don't actually trust you and they also don't voice their opinions, then maybe you're not actually providing autonomy, you just think you are. For example, if you constantly badger teams about justifying how they're applying your principles. Another way of positively influencing culture that is mentioned in the State of DevOps report is a climate for learning. So retrospectives, blameless postmortems, and of course learning is also helping each other do the right thing and making it easy to do the right thing. And for me, a success factor in doing things like principles is the attitude you take towards them. So do you take the attitude of telling people what to do? Or do you use these tools actually to foster a learning culture? So principles, the radar, all those are tools for me to help people, to help teams learn from each other and not stay in their autonomous bubble. So, and that's actually quite a common thing that's out there, I think. If you feel like you're an autonomous team, you forget asking other teams about, oh, did you do this before? So that's super important. Have things like guilds, show and tells across teams, inside a team, in the guild, making things visible, documentation, pairing, all those forms of communication. And then, of course, based on the talking, you should reflect and iterate on these things, so they shouldn't be set in stone. Maybe celebrate when you can scratch a principle out because you feel like it's become business as usual and you don't need to point it out anymore. And finally, I've just said it, record history and record the why, so that we don't spend lots of energy on challenging why something is the way it is, but we can quickly look it up and then take momentum and move forward. So that's the rationale part of principles, descriptions, or architecture decision records, or also documenting why you have principles, so that you can have those discussions also with new people coming in, so it's easier for people to participate and see that. So finally, if you now think, okay, I'm just a developer, I'm not in the position to drive forward organization level principles, what can I do? And you can start with your team, so asking more questions about the business, questioning, do I know how we make money? What are our architecture requirements we're focusing on? And then maybe if some of those things help you, maybe share successes or failures with other teams, and ultimately those things can then bubble up. So kind of maybe take a more viral approach to implementing these things. And another thing you can do is that if there is a more top-down effort for principles, maybe you're a very big organization where that's more practical, just be open to it and give the people who created them feedback about how it's helping you and how it isn't, and give it a chance. Yeah, that's all we have.
And really, as a final thing from this, we've passed on some things that we've learned here, but it's not as if we have all the answers, or if anybody really has all the answers to how to do this kind of more bottom-up cultivation approach to architecture. But what we do think we know is that by setting up some of these principles, you can develop this yourself, and you can find out what works in the context of your organization, how to be able to take that "it depends" answer and answer it within your particular limitations. And that is the most important thing, that you take the direction of this and you take the ownership and pushing of that. And that really goes right back to the very heart of the statements at the beginning of the Agile Manifesto, that teams should be responsible for deciding how to do things and how to evolve how they do things. And I hope that if you take that, you'll be able to go on and make some serious improvements. Thank you for listening to us.
Thank you very much for an engaging talk. Let's have a quick couple of questions. Yeah, is there a place for a dedicated software architect in a Scrum team?
For me, it depends on what you mean by architect. I think it makes sense that there's somebody in the team who maybe has the main ownership of architectural questions on the team, but it should never be that one person, and it should definitely a person who touches code every once in a while, or at least looks at the code very frequently.
Yeah, I mean, we often use the phrase tech lead at ThoughtWorks because we really have an aversion to the word architect. And so that's what we tend to use is tech lead. But stress the fact that you do often need a lead, someone to take the lead and to be a final decision point. But the thing we really want to avoid is the architect who never actually sees the source code. And also remember that an important part of leadership is mentoring and teaching the people around you. And so experienced people have a vital role in doing that.
And then ideally maybe that person would be the representative for the team in something like a guild or in something like a workshop, like the workshop I talked about, to represent the team and then bring those things back and explain what happened and what those things mean.
All right. How do you justify the benefit of an architectural change to the stakeholders before actually spending the time implementing it?
Well, it comes down to you have to look at it in terms of economics. You say, because of a problem with because of a decision that made sense a year ago, we are now in a position where we are going slower, and we think in the next 6 months or so, we are going slower than we would be if we made this architectural change. We therefore need to invest in this in order that we can actually make further progress. 6 months ago, a 2-lane road was perfectly adequate to cope with the traffic. Now we need a 4-lane road. So we have to invest to make the road wider, otherwise the traffic's going to jam up. But it's important to always do this in economic terms and to stress, and also go through the exercise. Why is the current architecture slowing us down at the moment? And try as much as possible to give some sense of how that's happening and the degree of effect that's doing it. But always focus on the economic reasons.
All right, we have time only for one more question, unfortunately. So sliders look good on paper, screen or whiteboard, but once set, how do you enforce the validity of those priorities in a customer-driven product when priorities are shifting according to the business layer?
I mean, priorities are going to change. That's something that we have to accept, and that we also can't throw our hands in the air all the time when it happens, but go with that flow. But I'm guessing that maybe the question is meant in the sense that priorities for the business are overriding priorities for the tech, which is like a very common challenge that teams have, I think. And for that, yeah, I think it takes experience, and again, therefore, it's maybe good to have like a more experienced developer on the team who takes more ownership for the architecture, to learn how to, that to your fellow developers, you talk about Docker differently than you would to a business person or than you would to a to the CTO or the CEO, right? So it takes a certain level of experience to learn how to do that, and there's no like one way to do this. I guess it depends on the situation, right?
Yeah, but I would stress it brings out the fact that any of these architectural decisions, whether it's the sliders, the radar, the principles, any of these tools we talk about, they're not created once and set in stone for years to come. They have to be regularly reviewed because circumstances change, the world changes. And as a result, you have to reconfigure around them. Now, usually modifying the current set, it takes less time than creating the set in the first place. But make sure you give that time for regular reviews of all of these things that we talk about so that you can track how things change as the world changes around you and as you learn more about what's working and not working within using the techniques themselves. We're always learning, and if we're not, we're falling behind.
Thank you so much.